The tin plate sat untouched in front of Ella Langston, and every single person crowded into the Redemption Creek Relief Shelter could see it sitting there, steaming in the cold November air of 1882. She had not moved to pick up her fork. She had not reached for the bread. She sat perfectly still at the edge of the long wooden table, her dark brown hair pulled back under a worn calico bonnet, her hands folded in her lap with a quiet, terrible patience that made the man watching her from across the room feel something shift deep inside his chest. James Merritt stood in the doorway of the old converted livery barn that served as the relief shelter, a bowl of stew balanced in one hand, and he could not look away from her. There were 14 children in that barn, children with hollow cheeks and enormous, frightened eyes, children who had survived the railroad collapse that had killed their fathers, the typhoid that had taken their mothers, the drought that had swallowed the land whole. 14 children with only one plate of hot food between them, because the supply wagon from the territorial government had arrived with less than half of what had been promised, and the woman running the shelter, a widow named Mrs. Potts, had done her frantic mathematics in the open air outside and come back in with her face pale as a winter moon. There were not enough meals. There were enough for the children, just barely, if no adult ate anything at all tonight. Mrs. Potts had explained this in a hushed, mortified voice to the 3 volunteers who had come to help serve. 2 of them, men from town, had grumbled and one had walked out entirely, muttering about driving to the next town for his own supper. The 3rd volunteer had said nothing. That was Ella. She had simply walked to the table, placed her own untouched plate directly in front of the smallest child, a girl of perhaps 4 years with a matted red braid, and sat back down with her hands in her lap. That was what James Merritt saw. And the reason he never forgot it had nothing to do with charity or spectacle. It had everything to do with the fact that there was not a single shred of performance in the gesture. She had not looked around to see if anyone was watching. She had not said a word, offered no speech, sought no recognition. She had simply done the thing that needed doing, absorbed the hunger into her own body, and sat with a stillness that looked less like sacrifice and more like breathing. As if starving so a child could eat was simply the most natural thing in the world to her. James set down his own bowl on the window ledge. He was not a man given to dramatic gestures. He was 31 years old, a cattle surveyor working a contract for the Abilene and Western Land Company, a man who had spent most of his adult life in the company of horses and survey maps and the silence of open plains. He had been passing through Redemption Creek, Texas, purely by chance, purely because his horse had thrown a shoe 3 miles outside of town on a road that led nowhere else, and purely because he had stopped at the blacksmith, and the blacksmith had mentioned in passing that the relief shelter needed help serving that evening. James had volunteered because he had nothing else to do, and because it seemed like the right thing. He had not expected to see anything that would change the shape of everything that came after. He crossed the barn and sat down across from her at the table. She looked up. Her eyes were gray, a particular shade of gray that reminded him of sky just before the first snow, and they were direct in a way that was rare and slightly startling, because most women he had met in 1882 had learned to look sideways at strangers, learned to soften their gaze into something safe and non-threatening. Ella Langston looked at him as if she were simply reading him, not unkindly, not boldly, just clearly. "You should eat something," he said. It was not what he had planned to say. He had not planned to say anything. "There is not enough for everyone," she said. Her voice was low and unhurried, with a faint trace of a southern accent worn smooth by years away from wherever she had started. "You work the whole day to set this up and then you do not eat," he said. "The children did not work the whole day either," she said. "They have simply existed in need. That is a harder kind of labor than anything I do." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up, went back to the window ledge, picked up his untouched bowl and walked it to the table. He set it down in front of a boy of about 7, who had been eyeing it with a desperate, practiced restraint. Then he came back and sat down across from Ella again. She was looking at him now with something new in her expression. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition, as if she had asked a question she had not spoken aloud and his action had answered it. "James Merritt," he said, and extended his hand across the table. She took it. Her grip was firm and unhesitating. "Ella Langston." Outside, the November wind moved through Redemption Creek like something with a purpose, rattling the barn doors in their frames and sending fingers of cold air under the floorboards. Inside, 14 children ate warm food, and 2 strangers sat across from each other in the lamplight and began the slow, irreversible process of becoming necessary to one another. He would learn later, much later, that she had not eaten the previous night either. She had refused then too, quietly, without fanfare, for the same reason. But on that first night, what he knew was only what he had seen, and what he had seen was enough to make him come back the following morning. Ella Langston had come to Redemption Creek 6 weeks earlier, in October of 1882, arriving on the Southern Pacific Line in a dress that had been washed so many times the blue had faded to the color of smoke. She had a carpet bag, a Bible with a cracked spine, a letter of introduction from a Methodist minister in Memphis, and a kind of self-possession that the women of Redemption Creek read as either admirable or alarming, depending entirely on their own temperament. She was 27 years old. She had been a school teacher in Memphis for 4 years before the school had been shut down for lack of funding. Before that, she had grown up in a small farm community outside of Nashville, the third of 5 children of a tobacco farmer who had gone to war with the Confederacy in 1861 and come home in 1865, a different man entirely, one who drank steadily and heavily, and left the raising of his children mostly to his wife and to Ella, who was the eldest girl, and had early learned the particular discipline of putting the needs of others before the demands of her own hunger. Literal and otherwise, she was not a tragic figure. She did not think of herself as one. She had simply grown up in a world where sacrifice was not called sacrifice. It was called Tuesday, and so she did it without ceremony and without expecting to be thanked. The relief shelter had been established 3 months before her arrival by a coalition of local churches responding to the cascade of disasters that had struck the county that year. A railroad bridge collapse in August had killed 11 men and left 7 families without breadwinners. A typhoid outbreak in September had taken a further 12 adults. The drought had been ongoing since the previous spring, and with the harvest failed and the cattle market depressed, Redemption Creek was a town doing its level best to pretend it was not drowning. The shelter was underfunded, understaffed, and perpetually short of supplies. The woman who had originally been running it, a formidable Baptist named Mrs. Adelaide Potts, was doing it alone with volunteer help that was inconsistent at best. When Ella arrived with her letter of introduction and her experience organizing a Memphis relief mission, Mrs. Potts had looked her up and down and said, simply, "Can you lift a flour sack?" And Ella had said, "Yes," and that had been the entirety of the hiring process. By the time James Merritt walked into that barn in November, Ella had been running the day-to-day operations of the shelter for 6 weeks and had developed the kind of competence that comes not from training but from necessity. She knew which suppliers in town would extend credit and which would not. She knew which families were too proud to ask for help and needed to be approached sideways, offered work in exchange for meals so that the transaction felt like dignity rather than charity. She knew which children were afraid to sleep in the dark and made sure the oil lamps were left burning low through the night. She also knew, with a clarity that she kept mostly to herself, that the shelter was 3 weeks away from running out of money entirely, and that the territorial government's commitment to the promised supply allotment was unreliable at best and dishonest at worst. She had been trying to figure out what to do about that when James Merritt had sat down across from her at the table and pushed his untouched bowl of stew toward a hungry child. He came back the next morning, as he had told himself he would not. His horse was reshod. His survey contract required him to be in Abilene by the 20th, which was 12 days away, which was more than enough time to ride the distance he needed to cover. There was no practical reason for him to remain in Redemption Creek. He came back anyway. She was already at the shelter when he arrived at 7 in the morning, stirring a pot of cornmeal porridge over the iron stove with one hand and writing something in a ledger with the other, a feat of coordination that he found impressive enough to comment on. "I have been keeping two things going at once since I was 9 years old," she said, without looking up from the ledger. "It becomes automatic. What are you writing?" "A letter to the county commissioner," she said, pointing out, with all the politeness I can manage and rather more specific numbers than he will be comfortable with, that the November supply allotment was 40% below the contracted amount, and that if December follows the same pattern, we will have a significant problem. Do you think he will respond?" She looked up from the ledger now, and there was a dry, careful humor in her expression that he had not seen the night before. "I think he will respond eventually," she said. "Whether his response will be useful is a different matter." "What would be useful?" James asked, and he was surprised to find that he meant the question genuinely, not as conversation but as a real inquiry, because something about the way she ran this place made him feel that her answers would be worth hearing. She set down the spoon and gave the question the consideration it deserved. "A reliable supply chain," she said, "not dependent on government promises. We need a direct relationship with a wholesale supplier in San Antonio, which would require someone to make the trip and negotiate the terms. We need a larger storage space because what we have cannot hold winter stock. And we need about $300 to bridge the gap until the spring donations come in from the Eastern Methodist Mission boards." She said all of this as matter-of-factly as if she were reciting a shopping list, and then she picked up the spoon and went back to the porridge. James stood in the doorway of the shelter kitchen and felt the particular, somewhat alarming sensation of a man who has just realized that a problem he has nothing to do with has become, somehow, his problem. "I know a wholesale supplier in San Antonio," he said. "I worked a survey contract for his transport company 2 years ago. He owes me a professional courtesy." She turned and looked at him with that direct, reading gaze. "You are a cattle surveyor passing through on a contract deadline," she said. "Why would you spend your professional courtesies on a relief shelter in a town you will leave in a week?" It was a fair question. It was, in fact, precisely the question he had been asking himself since he had walked out of the shelter the previous night with his stomach empty and his mind very full. "Because the children need feeding," he said. "And because you clearly need help, and I can provide some of it." She looked at him for a long moment, the gray eyes moving over his face in that careful, measuring way that he was beginning to recognize as her version of thinking hard about something. "The wholesale supplier's name?" she asked. "Heinrich Bauer," he said. "He runs a dry goods and provision house on Commerce Street in San Antonio. He is German, very direct, and he respects people who come to him with clear numbers, which you appear to have." Something shifted in her expression, just slightly. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the beginning of a kind of trust that was all the more meaningful for being clearly given rarely. "I will write 2 letters this morning then," she said, turning back to the stove. "One to the county commissioner and one to Mr. Bauer." "I can carry the one to Bauer personally," James said. "My route takes me south before it turns east. San Antonio is not far from my path." She was quiet for a moment, stirring the porridge. "That would be helpful," she said, and the simplicity of it, the lack of effusion or excessive gratitude, was somehow more meaningful than any elaborate thank you would have been. He stayed that day and the day after. His survey contract, he had decided, could accommodate a modest delay. He found himself doing things he had not done since childhood, carrying water, splitting firewood, fixing a broken door hinge that had been banging in the wind for what looked like several weeks. He ate lunch with the children at the long table, simple meals of bread and beans, and he watched Ella move through the shelter with the particular efficiency of someone who has learned to do a great deal with very little, and to do it without complaint. On the third day, as they were sorting through a donation of second-hand clothing that had arrived in a buckboard from a church 2 towns over, he asked her how she had come to be in Redemption Creek. She was holding up a small coat, checking it for tears, and she answered the question without hesitation, which told him she had made her peace with the story. "I was offered the position by mail," she said, "from the minister who wrote my letter of introduction. He had corresponded with Mrs. Potts about finding someone with experience to help run the shelter. I had just lost my teaching position in Memphis. The school's funding had been cut, which is a polite way of saying that the people responsible for providing it had decided that educating the children of freed families was not a priority worth sustaining." She said this without heat, but with a precision that made the injustice of it ring sharper than outrage would have. "You were teaching at a freedmen's school," he said. "I was teaching children who needed teaching," she said. "The distinction of which children they were should not be relevant to whether they deserve education, though I am well aware that many people disagree with me." "I do not disagree with you," he said. She glanced at him. "No," she said, and there was something in her voice that suggested she had already formed this opinion of him and was simply confirming it. "I did not think you did." He looked at her then, really looked at her, in the clear afternoon light coming through the shelter's small window, and he saw what the lamplight of the first night had only suggested. The tiredness around her eyes, which was not a tiredness of laziness but of sustained, purposeful effort. The way her hands, capable and quick, showed the wear of hard work done consistently over time. The set of her mouth, which was serious but not severe, because there was a quality of inner warmth in her that surfaced unexpectedly in the way her expression changed when she was talking to the children, or when something genuinely struck her as funny, which happened more often than he had initially expected. She was not a soft woman. She had clearly not had the kind of life that produced softness. But there was a depth of feeling in her that she carried with great care, as if she had learned that the world had a tendency to treat openly feeling people carelessly, and she had decided to feel carefully. He thought, standing there in the second-hand clothing sorting station of a struggling relief shelter in the Texas Panhandle, that he had never in his life met anyone quite like her. He left for San Antonio on the 5th day, carrying her letter to Heinrich Bauer, and 2 additional letters she had written to church mission boards in Dallas and Houston, having asked for his honest assessment of which routes the mail was most reliably delivered along, and adjusted her distribution strategy accordingly. She had walked out with him to where his horse, a solid bay gelding named Compass, was waiting at the hitching post. The morning was cold and bright, the kind of November morning that felt like a warning about what December intended. "I will be back within 10 days, he said. "You have a contract in Abilene," she said, not accusingly, simply factually. She was very good at simply factually. "I have written to my employer explaining a delay," he said. "The contract allows for reasonable delays due to conditions. I intend to argue that my horse going lame qualifies, which is near enough to the truth that I can say it without my conscience objecting too loudly." Her mouth moved in the beginning of a smile. "Your conscience seems fairly active," she said. "It is inconvenient sometimes," he agreed. She looked at him in that direct way. "Come back if you can," she said. "If you cannot, the letters you are carrying are more important than your presence here, so do not feel bound." "I will come back," he said. He rode south with the feeling, strong and somewhat confusing, that Compass could have been pointed in any direction, and he would have found a way to turn the animal around eventually. San Antonio was a 4-day ride in the November conditions, cold nights and dry days with a persistent north wind that made the prairie feel wider and emptier than it already was. James rode and thought about Ella Langston with a thoroughness that surprised him. He was not a man who fell easily into sentiment. He had been engaged once, 7 years ago, to a woman in Kansas City named Clara who had eventually, and not unreasonably, decided that a man whose work kept him on the plains for 8 months of every year was not the kind of man she wanted to build a life with. He had understood her reasoning, agreed with it even, and had subsequently conducted himself in the years since with the practical conclusion that his life was not well suited to close attachment. He had believed this conclusion to be sound, and had held it without particular grief. He was finding, on the road to San Antonio in November of 1882, that the conclusion felt significantly less sound than it had 3 weeks ago. Heinrich Bauer received him on the second morning after his arrival in the city, in a large, well-organized warehouse on Commerce Street that smelled of coffee and dried spices, and the particular clean smell of well-kept burlap. Bauer was a stocky, white-haired German of about 60 who had the bearing of a man who had built everything he owned with his own hands, which was in fact what he had done, having arrived in Texas from Hamburg in 1855 with $40 and a willingness to work until he fell over. James presented Ella's letter and watched Bauer read it. Bauer read it twice. Then he looked up. "This woman knows her numbers," he said. "She is asking for a wholesale arrangement at cost plus 8%, payment on 60-day terms, with a standing monthly order she has laid out in specific quantities by category." He tapped the letter with one finger. "She has done her research. These quantities are accurate for a shelter of this size." "She is thorough," James said. "She is more than thorough," Bauer said. "She is professional." He set the letter down and looked at James with a slight, shrewd smile. "And how is it that a cattle surveyor is carrying correspondence for a relief shelter in Redemption Creek?" "A complicated question," James said. Bauer's smile widened slightly. "Yes," he said, "I imagine it is." He agreed to the terms Ella had proposed with only minor modifications, reducing the payment period to 45 days and requiring a small initial deposit that James, after a moment of internal accounting, agreed to advance himself from his survey earnings, to be repaid when the mission board donations came through. It was not a thing he had planned to do. He found he did not mind having done it. He rode back north with a signed agreement in his saddlebag, and something that felt dangerously like purpose. He arrived in Redemption Creek on the 9th day after his departure, 2 days earlier than he had estimated, because he had pushed the pace more than was strictly necessary, and had told himself it was because the weather looked like it was turning, which was partly true. The shelter was in a different state than when he had left. There were more people in it, 3 new families who had arrived after a farmhouse fire 2 counties over, and the shortage of space was immediately visible. Ella was in the middle of reorganizing the sleeping arrangements when he walked in, moving cots with the efficient, slightly grim expression of a woman solving a spatial problem that did not have a clean solution. She saw him, and something happened in her face that she did not quite manage to put away before he saw it, a quick, unguarded relief that was immediately replaced by her usual composed expression, but that had been there, visible and real, for just a moment. "You are early," she said. "The weather looked like it was turning," he said. "It was turning 2 days ago," she said. "We have had sleet." "I know, I rode through some of it." She stopped what she was doing and looked at him properly. "Did you see Bauer?" He reached into his coat and produced the signed agreement and handed it to her. She read it standing there between 2 cots, and as she read, the careful composure of her face did something extraordinary. It did not break exactly, it was not dramatic, but it shifted, the tightness around her eyes releasing, the set of her shoulders dropping perhaps half an inch, and she drew one long, slow breath that was not quite a sigh but had all of a sigh's meaning. "He agreed to the cost-plus arrangement," she said. "With modifications," James said and explained them. When he got to the part about the initial deposit, she looked up sharply. "You advanced the deposit yourself," she said. "It will be repaid from the mission board donations," he said. "The timing works out." "James." She said his name for the first time, and it had a weight to it, a directness that matched everything else about her. "That is your own money." "It is a temporary use of my own money," he said. "There is a difference." She looked at him steadily. "Why?" she asked, and it was not an aggressive question, it was a real one. The kind of question she asked about everything, directly and without pretense, because she genuinely wanted to understand. He met her gaze. "Because you refused to eat until the children were fed," he said, "and I have not been able to stop thinking about that." The silence between them was brief and charged with something that neither of them named yet, because they were both people who chose their words with care and moved toward important things slowly. "The agreement will help enormously," she said finally. "Thank you. Where do you need me?" he asked. She put him to work moving the supply crates to make room for the new families, and they worked side by side through the afternoon in the way that people work when they are comfortable with each other, speaking when there was something to say and silent when there was not. And the silence was easy in a way that James had not often experienced with another person. That evening, after the children were settled and the new families had eaten, and the shelter had quieted to its nighttime hum of sleeping people and low lamplight, Ella made 2 cups of coffee on the iron stove and brought them to the small table near the back where she did her paperwork, and she set one in front of the chair across from hers. He understood the invitation and sat down. They talked for 2 hours. She told him about Memphis, about the freedmen's school and the children she had taught, about the political pressure that had ultimately shut the school down, and the cold, specific rage she had felt watching something good and necessary be dismantled by people who had never set foot in a classroom. She told it without bitterness, or rather, she had converted the bitterness into something that powered her work, the way you bank a coal fire so it gives heat without burning wild. He told her about his years of survey work, the long solitary stretches of the plains that he had learned to love for their honesty, the way the land out here told you the truth about itself without any prettying up, and how he had come to believe that things which were genuinely beautiful were generally things that were also genuinely hard, and that the two qualities were more connected than most people acknowledged. She listened to this with the full, focused attention that was characteristic of her, and then said, thoughtfully, "I think you are right about that, though I suspect it can also become an excuse for romanticizing difficulty." He had laughed at that, a genuine laugh startled out of him, and she had looked at him with a quiet pleasure at having provoked it. "You are exactly right," he said. "I will be more careful with the philosophy." "It was a good piece of philosophy," she said. "It just needed a small correction." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight and thought that he had been wrong a few weeks ago in his confident conclusion about his life's unsuitability for close attachment. He had been working with insufficient data. He had been in Redemption Creek for almost 3 weeks when the letter arrived from his employer. It was not an angry letter. His employer, a measured man named Aldrich Castle, who ran the Abilene and Western Land Company with the precision of a clockmaker, had written to inform James that the Abilene contract had been reassigned to another surveyor, and that while Castle appreciated James's dedication to civic causes, the company's schedule did not accommodate open-ended delays, and James's next contract would begin in February in the Oklahoma Territory, which left him, in practical terms, with no professional obligations until then. He read the letter on the front step of the boarding house where he had been renting a room in the cold December light, and sat with its contents for a considerable time. Then he went to find Ella. She was at the shelter, as she almost always was, working with 2 of the older children on reading lessons at the long table. She had discovered within her first weeks that several of the children in the shelter's care had never attended school, and had organized informal lessons in the mornings before the day's other work began. She used whatever materials she could find, old newspapers, almanac pages, the backs of supply ledger sheets, and she taught with a focused patience that made James think of what the freedmen's school must have been like. He waited until the lesson was finished and the children had dispersed, and then he told her about the letter. She listened. She did not immediately offer sympathy or expressions of concern, which was one of the things he had come to appreciate about her. She thought about the information first. "The February contract in Oklahoma," she said. "What does that involve?" "Land surveys for a settlement company," he said. 6 weeks of work north of the Indian Territory line. And between now and February, I am at liberty," he said. She was looking at the table, and he could see her thinking, the particular quality of concentration she brought to problems. "We need to build the storage space," she said. "The Bauer arrangement requires us to take monthly deliveries, and we have nowhere adequate to store them. And Mrs. Potts has mentioned that she may need to step back from the shelter in January because her daughter in Fort Worth is expecting a child and needs help." She said all of this as information, as facts relevant to the shelter's operational situation, and not as any kind of request or appeal. "I am a fair hand with construction," James said, "and I have time." She looked up at him. "James, you have already advanced money and spent weeks here that your contract likely would have paid better." "My contract is currently paying me nothing," he said, "which resolves one part of the comparison, and the money is temporary, I told you that." "And the weeks?" she asked. She said it quietly, directly, with the kind of steady gaze that did not allow for evasive answers. He held her gaze. "The weeks," he said, "have been the best use of my time I can recently recall." The silence between them now had a different quality than it had before. It was not just the ease of people who had grown comfortable with each other. It was charged with the awareness of something that had been building between them steadily since that first night, something that they had both acknowledged in small ways: the shared coffee, the hours of conversation, the way they had gradually moved from professional courtesy to something that had no professional name. "I am not a woman who operates well on implication," Ella said, with a careful, slightly wry precision. "If you are saying something, I would rather you said it plainly." He admired this about her so much it was almost painful. "I am saying," he said, with equal care, "that I came back from San Antonio faster than I needed to. That I have found reasons to stay longer than I planned. That every morning I come to this shelter I tell myself it is because the work needs doing, and it does, but that is not the only reason, and I think we both know it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I knew it when you pushed your stew toward that boy on the first night." He blinked. "You noticed that." "I notice everything," she said simply. "I was raised to pay attention because inattention was costly. I noticed that you did it the way I gave away my plate, without looking around to see if anyone was watching." "I was watching you," he said. "I know," she said, "and I was watching you watching me. And what I saw was that you did not do it to impress me. You did it because it was the right thing." She said it with a matter-of-factness that moved him more than drama would have. "Ella," he said. "James," she said. "I would like to court you," he said. "Properly, with your full and informed understanding of what that means, which is that I have a February contract in Oklahoma that will last 6 weeks, after which my schedule is genuinely open. I do not have a house. I have a horse, a good reputation in my trade, savings sufficient to build something, and the very strong conviction that I would like to build it near you if you are willing to consider the idea." She looked at him for a long, steady moment. Outside, the December wind moved through Redemption Creek with its particular purpose. "I have been considering the idea," she said, "for approximately 2 weeks." He smiled then, a real smile, the kind that took over his whole face in a way that was not particularly dignified, and that she found, quietly and privately, to be one of the most appealing things she had ever seen. "We should build the storage space first," she said, and the hint of humor in her voice was warm and gentle, "and then discuss the rest." They built the storage space over the following 2 weeks, James doing the heavier construction work, and Ella directing operations with the architectural precision of someone who had been solving spatial problems with limited materials her entire life. 2 men from town joined in when they saw what was being built, and a hardware store owner named Clement Grove donated the roofing nails at cost, in a gesture of community support that Ella immediately followed up with a written thank you and a quiet mention to the 3 families at the shelter who had spoken about needing hardware work done in the spring. She was, James observed, relentless in her networking, not in a calculating way but in the deeply practical way of someone who understood that community was a web and every thread mattered. By Christmas of 1882, The shelter had its storage space, its Bauer supply arrangement operating smoothly, its mission board funding confirmed for the spring, and 14 children who were better fed, warmer, and several of whom could now read simple sentences that they had not been able to read in October. On Christmas Eve, after the children had been settled with small gifts that Ella had procured through what James could only describe as an act of sustained creative logistics involving 6 different donors, 2 church congregations, and a very well-timed letter to a dry goods merchant in San Antonio who owed Bauer a favor, she and James sat on the front step of the shelter in the cold night air with 2 cups of coffee, and the stars very clear and present overhead. "My mother used to say that the stars were the same stars everywhere," Ella said, "that wherever you were under the same sky. I found that comforting when I was far from home." "Are you far from home?" he asked. She considered this. "I'm not sure where home is anymore," she said. "The farm in Tennessee is not what it was. Memphis was a kind of home, but it is gone." She paused. "I think home may be a thing I have not located yet." "I think that too," he said, "though I am beginning to develop a theory about where mine might be." She looked at him sideways, the gray eyes warm in the darkness. "Is your theory by any chance geographically specific?" she asked. "It is becoming more specific by the week," he said. She leaned her shoulder, very slightly, against his. It was a small gesture and deliberate, and he understood it completely and leaned back, and they sat that way under the Christmas stars of 1882, 2 people who had found each other sideways, through hunger and stew bowls and ledger numbers, and the particular kind of recognition that happens when you see someone do the right thing when they think no one is watching. January came in cold and difficult. Mrs. Potts left for Fort Worth as planned, which made Ella the sole full-time person responsible for running the shelter, a weight that James saw settling on her, and did what he could to help carry, though his skills were more mechanical than administrative, and he was honest about where he was useful and where he was not. In the second week of January, a complication arrived in the form of a man named Douglas Harp. Harp was the county commissioner's deputy, a thin-faced, carefully dressed man of about 40 who appeared at the shelter one morning with an official manner and a document he wanted Ella to look at. The document was a proposal to consolidate the Redemption Creek Relief Shelter with a larger county facility in Mineral Wells, 40 miles away, which would, Harp explained with bureaucratic smoothness, result in more efficient use of county resources. Ella read the document standing in the shelter doorway while Harp stood before her with the patient expression of a man who assumed the outcome was already decided. This would require the families currently housed here to travel 40 miles to Mineral Wells, she said. Transportation would be arranged, Harp said. In January, she said. With 3 families who have children under 5 years old and 2 adults who are still recovering from illness. The county would ensure appropriate, and the Mineral Wells facility, she said, consulting the document, is operated by a private management company under county contract, which company has a significant cost per resident incentive to maintain low provision levels. Harp's patient expression developed a slight tightness at the edges. The county has determined, the county, Ella said, with that precise, unhurried diction, has determined that consolidation would reduce its direct administrative costs by routing responsibility to a private operator, which is a reasonable financial calculation from the county's perspective and a hidden danger for the people in my care. James, who had been doing something with a broken window shutter nearby and had gradually stopped doing anything at all, watched this exchange with something approaching awe. "Miss Langston," Harp said, "this is not optional. The county has the authority. The county has the authority to close its direct funding," Ella said, "which it may exercise whenever it chooses. Our supply arrangement with Bauer in San Antonio is not county-dependent, nor is our mission board funding. If the county withdraws its support, we will operate on private funding until we can establish a legal foundation for the shelter that is entirely outside county jurisdiction." She said this with the calm of someone who had thought this through long before today. Harp looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has encountered an unexpected obstacle in a process he had assumed was routine. "I will convey your response to the commissioner," he said. "Please do," she said. "I will also be writing to the commissioner directly and copying the Methodist Mission Board, the Dallas Herald, and the district judge's office on my correspondence." Folded the document and returned it to him. "Good morning, Mr. Harp." After he had gone, James came to stand beside her in the doorway. "The Dallas Herald," he said. "One letter," she said, "to a reporter I met once who covers territorial governance. He may or may not print anything, but the threat of coverage is often more effective than the coverage itself." "You have been thinking about this contingency," he said. "Since November," she said. "The Bauer arrangement was partly about this. Reducing our dependence on county supply was deliberate." He looked at her. "Ella, yes, you are extraordinary," he said quietly and plainly. She looked at him with that gray gaze, and for a moment the composure shifted just slightly, and something tender and exposed moved through her face before she composed herself again. "I am practical," she said, "and the children need protecting." "Both things can be true," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer than usual. Then she said, "Go and fix the window shutter. The cold comes in badly on the north side." He went and fixed the window shutter. The county commissioner, having received Ella's letter and apparently discussed the Dallas Herald situation with his deputy, withdrew the consolidation proposal the following week with a brief official note that cited administrative review. Ella filed the note in her correspondence ledger without comment, but James saw the satisfaction in her face and thought it was one of the most beautiful things he had ever seen. He left for Oklahoma in February as contracted. The morning he left, she was at the shelter already, because she was always at the shelter already, and he found her at the iron stove making the morning porridge, and he stood in the kitchen doorway watching her for a moment before she heard him. And for that moment he let himself simply look at her and acknowledge, without any reservation or qualification, what he felt. She turned and saw him and said, "You are early." "I wanted to say goodbye properly," he said. She set down the spoon and turned fully to face him. She was wearing a dark gray dress that was still a practical garment and not a beautiful one, but she had changed her hair, and he noticed this, pinned differently than usual with more care, and he understood this as its own kind of statement. 6 weeks, he said. 6 weeks, she agreed. The Spring Mission Board funds should arrive by then, and Mrs. Potts is writing about returning in March. "Ella," he said. "James," she said. He crossed the kitchen and took her hands, which she gave him without hesitation, and he held them and looked at her. "I am coming back," he said. "I know," she said. "And when I come back," he said, "I would like to ask you something important." She looked at him with steady gray eyes. "I have a general understanding of what the question might be," she said. "Does that understanding include a preliminary answer?" he asked. Something warm and genuine moved through her expression. "It includes," she said carefully, "a strong inclination toward yes." He raised her hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles, which was not a thing he had done before and which made her breath catch in a way she did not entirely suppress, and then he released her hands and stepped back. 6 weeks, he said. "Go," she said. "Come back." He rode north out of Redemption Creek in the February cold, and did not look back until he was at the ridge above town, and then he turned compass around and sat for a moment looking at the cluster of buildings below, the shelter visible among them, smoke rising from its chimney into the clear winter sky. Then he turned north and rode. Oklahoma in February was cold and flat and demanding, the kind of survey work that required full concentration because the territory conditions were complicated, not just geographically but politically, because the area north of the Indian Territory line was in the middle of ongoing disputes about land use and settlement rights that touched on the painful and unresolved questions of what had been done to the peoples whose land this had originally been. James did his survey work with the professional precision Castle required, and he also did it with an awareness, sharpened by weeks in Ella's company, of the human consequences of the lines he drew. He wrote her letters. This was something he had not done, writing personal letters, since his engagement to Clara, and he found that the practice came more naturally than he remembered, because Ella was the kind of correspondent who made you want to tell her things, who asked questions in her letters that required real thought, who did not write sentimentally, but with a warmth that was all the more affecting for being contained in precise, honest language. She wrote back promptly and substantially. She told him about the shelter, about the families, about the children's reading progress, about the mission board funds that arrived in mid-March as expected. She told him about a remarkable thing that had happened, that one of the families at the shelter, the Corrigan family, father and mother and 3 children who had arrived in the worst circumstances imaginable after the August railroad collapse, had found a path forward through a combination of the county labor program and a church-sponsored land grant, and were leaving the shelter in March to begin their own farm operation outside of town. She wrote about this with a quiet joy that was, he had learned, her most intense emotional register, because joy for Ella was not a loud thing, it was a deep thing, and when it was deep, it was very deep indeed. He counted the days. He returned to Redemption Creek on a Tuesday in late March, ahead of schedule because the survey had been cleaner than projected and the weather had cooperated, and he had not written ahead to say he was coming because the mail was unreliable along that route, and he had not wanted to set an expectation he might not meet. He arrived in the late afternoon and rode directly to the shelter, which was in its usual state of purposeful activity, 3 children on the front step doing arithmetic on a slate board, the sound of something being cooked emanating from inside, and the particular organized energy that Ella generated wherever she went. She was in the supply room when he found her, standing on a low stool to reach the upper shelf, and she heard his boots on the wooden floor and turned, still on the stool, and looked down at him. For a moment neither of them said anything. Then she stepped down from the stool and he was right there to offer his hand, and she took it and stepped down and did not quite let go of his hand after she had done so. "You are early," she said. "That seems to be a habit," he said. "A good one," she said, and she was looking at him with an expression that she was, for once, not entirely regulating. "I want to ask you that question," he said. "Now," she said, "in the supply room." "I have been thinking about it for 6 weeks and I do not want to wait for a more atmospheric location," he said. She laughed. It was a genuine, unguarded laugh, and it did something wonderful to her whole face, and he looked at her laughing in the supply room of the Redemption Creek Relief Shelter and knew, with a certainty that felt like the most solid ground he had ever stood on, exactly what he wanted for the rest of his life. He took both her hands. "Ella Langston," he said. "I am a cattle surveyor with no permanent residence, a horse named Compass, and a significant personal conviction that the best thing that has ever happened to me was a horse throwing a shoe 3 miles outside of this town. I would like to marry you if you will have me. I will live wherever you need to live. I will build whatever needs building. I will carry letters to San Antonio and advance deposits and fix north-facing shutters, and give away my dinner whenever it is the right thing to do, because that is what you have shown me matters. I would like to spend my life learning to be the kind of person that you already are." She was quiet for a moment, with the particular quality of quiet that was her deepest kind of attention. "You already are that kind of person," she said. "You just needed someone to see it." "Is that a yes?" he asked. "James," she said, with a warmth and a steadiness and a directness that were entirely and completely her, "that is an absolute yes." He kissed her then, right there between the shelved flour sacks and the neatly stacked dried beans, with the sounds of children doing arithmetic on the front step drifting in through the supply room window. And it was not a grand gesture or a dramatic moment. It was simply real and right and warm and good, which was, he thought, exactly what everything with Ella was. They were married in June of 1883 in the garden of the First Methodist Church of Redemption Creek, on a clear morning that smelled of late spring grass and the distant edge of summer. Mrs. Potts was there, firmly returned from Fort Worth and tearful in the particular defiant way of women who cry at weddings and are annoyed at themselves for it. Heinrich Bauer had sent a crate of excellent provisions from San Antonio with a note that said simply, "Say your gut. Well done." The children from the shelter were there too, arranged in a somewhat disorganized row, the older ones having appointed themselves unofficial decorators, and festooned the garden with wildflowers picked from the creek bank. The vows were simple and direct, because Ella had written her portion herself, and it was characteristic of her that what she wrote was honest rather than elaborate. "I promise to always tell you the truth," she said, looking at him with those steady gray eyes. "Even when the truth is difficult. I promise to put our family first, but never to use that as an excuse to close my eyes to the world outside it. I promise to work beside you, not behind you, and I ask the same of you in return." He had not written his vows ahead of time, which she knew and had not remarked on, and which he felt now as a slight vulnerability, because she had just said something so precisely right, and he had only himself to answer with. "I promise," he said, "to see you, clearly, fully, and continuously, and to never stop being grateful for what I see." She looked at him, and the composure shifted completely, just for a moment, and what was underneath it was luminous and real and entirely hers. "That will do," she said, very quietly. The minister, who had been planning a longer ceremony, glanced at the two of them and made a sensible decision to move briskly to the conclusion. They stayed in Redemption Creek through the summer of 1883, James taking on a series of local survey and assessment jobs that kept him within the county while Ella continued her work at the shelter, which was gradually transitioning, through her careful management and the sustained relationships she had built, from a crisis response facility into something more like a permanent community resource, a place that offered not just emergency shelter but job connection, literacy education, and the kind of consistent practical support that prevented families from falling into crisis in the first place. James helped her write a formal proposal for a community trust structure that would give the shelter legal independence and a sustainable funding model, a document that drew on his business experience with the land companies and her operational knowledge of exactly what the shelter needed to function. They sat at the kitchen table of the small house they had rented on Cedar Street, Redemption Creek's quietest block, working on sections by lamplight in the evenings, arguing occasionally about language in the particular vigorous way of two people who both care about precision and are not afraid to disagree. "This section on governance," she said one evening in August, tapping a page with her pen. "You have written it to allow for a single administrator. I want a board." "A board takes longer to make decisions," he said. "A board prevents any one person from making unilateral decisions that affect the community," she said, "including me. I do not want the shelter's future dependent on my continued presence. That is a fragile structure." He looked at her, and then he revised the governance section. She was right, which was frequently the case, and he had learned early in their marriage that acknowledging this promptly saved considerable time. In October of 1883, Ella told him she was pregnant. She told him in the morning at the kitchen table with the same direct practicality with which she approached everything, and then she waited while he absorbed the information and said, "Are you well?" "Very well," she said. "I am perhaps 6 weeks along. I have spoken to the doctor in town. Everything appears to be proceeding normally." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him hold it, and they sat for a moment in the morning light in the kitchen of their small house on Cedar Street with this new fact between them, enormous and tender. "A child," he said. "Yes," she said. "Ella," he said. "I know," she said. He raised her hand and pressed his mouth to her palm, which was a gesture that had become, in their 6 months of marriage, one of their private languages, and she let him. And there was a softness in her face that she reserved for moments when it was only the two of them, that he thought of as the face underneath the face, the one she had been protecting for so long and had, gradually, stopped needing to protect. They spent the winter in Redemption Creek, the shelter's trust documents completed and filed in November, the community board established with 5 members including Ella as founding administrator, Heinrich Bauer as supply coordinator, an honorary and largely symbolic role that he had accepted with great seriousness, and 3 respected community members. The shelter was, by December, the most stable and well-organized it had been since its founding, which allowed Ella to begin, gradually, to step back from the all-consuming daily management and trust the systems they had built. James had accepted a spring contract in the hill country south of Austin, a substantial survey job for a settlement company that would pay well and take him away for 2 months, which they discussed at length and honestly, weighing the financial security against the timing with Ella's baby due in late May. "The contract ends April 15th, James said. "The baby is not expected until late May. That is 6 weeks of margin. "The doctor says these things are not always predictable," Ella said. "If there is any indication of earlier timing, I will come home," he said. "I will make this explicit in my contract terms." "The money would give us the foundation to buy land," she said. "Which is what we need." "Yes," he said, "but not at any cost." She looked at him with that steady gaze. "Go," she said, "but be within riding distance when April begins." He went, and he was within riding distance when April began, and the baby came in late May as expected, 3 weeks after his return, and it was a boy. They named him Thomas, for no grand historical reason, but because they both liked the sound of it, and because Thomas had been the name of the Methodist minister who had written Ella's letter of introduction to Redemption Creek, a man who had set in motion, without knowing it, the entire chain of events that had led to this morning in the bedroom of their small house on Cedar Street, with the window open, and the May air coming in, and a newborn in Ella's arms and James sitting on the edge of the bed, with an expression on his face that could only be described as comprehensively undone. "He is very small," James said. "He is a perfectly appropriate size," Ella said, with the absolute confidence of a woman who had researched this thoroughly. "He is looking at me," James said. "Newborns do not focus well," Ella said. "He is not specifically looking at you." "He is looking at me," James said with quiet certainty. Ella looked at her husband looking at their son, and the face underneath the face was very visible in that moment, warm and full, and without any of its usual careful containment. "He has your chin," she said. "He has your everything else," he said, which was true, the baby having arrived with a full head of dark hair and an already apparent quality of focused attention that was entirely his mother's. "Thomas," James said softly to the baby. "Hello." The baby made a small sound and James looked up at Ella and she looked back at him, and they smiled at each other across their son in a way that needed no words and would have been diminished by them. They bought land that fall, 40 acres east of Redemption Creek, good grazing land with a creek tributary running along the northern boundary, and a stand of live oaks that Ella had identified on a riding survey as the ideal location for a house. James built the house over the winter of 1883 to 1884, with help from 2 men from town, and it was not a grand house. It was a solid, practical, well-considered house designed specifically by the 2 of them for the life they actually intended to live. It had a large kitchen. Because Ella cooked for more people than most households, the shelter families were frequent guests. It had a room that was designated from the beginning as a study, with good light from the east window and shelves that James built to Ella's exact specifications, because she had very specific ideas about how books should be organized. It had a wide front porch that faced west, toward town, and a back porch that faced east, toward the open land, because James liked to sit in the mornings and watch the light come across the prairie. Thomas learned to walk on that back porch in the spring of 1884, lurching between his mother's hands and his father's with the single-minded determination of a child who has decided that he will do this particular thing and will not be deterred. And when he finally made it across the full width of the porch on his own, Ella picked him up and laughed, and James watched them together and felt something in his chest that had no adequate name but that was related, he thought, to everything he had first seen in that barn in November of 1882. The shelter continued to function and grow, under the community board's oversight and with Ella's ongoing involvement in a more advisory capacity, freeing her from the daily administrative weight while keeping her connected to the work she had built. She began, in 1884, to develop a more formal literacy program, partnering with the new public school that had opened in Redemption Creek to create evening classes for adults and older children who had missed formal education, which drew participants from families across the county, including, quietly and carefully, several families from the Mexican community that had been largely excluded from the existing schools. A situation that Ella addressed with her characteristic method of simply doing the right thing and letting the results speak for the necessity of it. James's survey work had by this point evolved, through a combination of his reputation and his deliberate choices, into a more settled practice focused on the hill country and panhandle regions of Texas, taking contracts of manageable duration that kept him within a reasonable distance of home. He had also, through the land they owned and the contacts he had built, begun to develop a secondary income in land assessment work for smaller settlers and families who needed professional guidance but could not afford the large company fees, a service he offered on a sliding scale that drove his accountant, when he eventually had one, to mild professional despair. He did not, in the end, mind the slightly reduced income this represented. He had what he needed. He had considerably more than he had needed, which was the house, the land, the work, and the woman he came home to every evening. In the spring of 1885, Ella became pregnant again. This one was harder, the first trimester difficult in ways the first pregnancy had not been, and there were 2 weeks in March where James watched her manage everything around her with the controlled energy of a person running on will rather than comfort. And he made meals and carried Thomas and sat with her in the evenings with a quiet, steady presence that she received without protest, which told him how much she needed it. She came through it. She was fundamentally a resilient person, not because she did not feel difficulty, but because she had a very long history of getting through it. And the second pregnancy resolved into a smooth and uneventful middle and late term. In October of 1885, they had a daughter. They named her Margaret, which had been James's mother's name, and Ella had suggested this without prompting, which had moved him in a way he had not entirely managed to conceal. Margaret arrived already apparently opinionated, with a set of lungs that Thomas, at nearly 2 years old, regarded with wide-eyed alarm from his safe position in the doorway, and a quality of demanding attention that was quite different from her brother's focused intensity. "She is loud," Thomas said. "She has opinions," Ella said, from the bed, holding her daughter with the competent certainty of someone who had been near babies consistently for the past several years. "There is nothing wrong with having opinions, Thomas. The important thing is learning to express them constructively." Thomas considered this. "She is expressing them very loudly," he said. "She will learn more precise methods as she develops," Ella said, and caught James's eye over Thomas's head, and the look they exchanged was everything, warm and full of the particular humor of two people who know each other well and love what they know. James came to sit beside her on the bed and looked at his daughter, and then at his son standing cautious in the doorway, and then at his wife, and the word home, which had been uncertain and unlocated for so many years, was very clear and very specific to him now. "Hello, Margaret," he said. Margaret, as if evaluating whether he was worthy of her attention, directed her gaze approximately toward him and then cried with renewed vigor, which he chose to interpret as a positive response. Redemption Creek changed over the years that followed, as all places change, sometimes for better and sometimes for harder. The drought that had defined the early 1880s eventually broke, and the cattle market recovered some of its stability, and the town grew, new families coming in from the east and from across the border and from the eastern states, drawn by land availability and opportunity and the particular western promise of a new start. The shelter evolved too, eventually becoming what Ella had envisioned from the beginning, a community support center with a small endowment, a full-time paid administrator who Ella had trained herself over 2 years, a reading room open to the public 3 afternoons a week, and a job placement service that connected arriving families with the labor the county's growing agricultural sector needed. It was not a dramatic success story. It was better than that. It was a sustained and functional piece of community infrastructure that did its work quietly and consistently, which was, as Ella had always understood, what actually helped people. She was invited in 1887 to speak at a regional Methodist conference in Dallas about community welfare organization, and she went, taking Margaret with her on the train because the baby was still nursing, and leaving James at home with Thomas, which was an arrangement that produced several days of earnest, practical cohabitation between father and 4-year-old son that Thomas would later describe, as an adult, as foundational to his understanding of how to take things seriously. James had driven them to the station in the wagon, a proper spring wagon they had purchased the previous year, and had stood on the platform while Ella organized their bags and settled Margaret in a comfortable position. And he had watched her with the particular quality of attention that had never diminished in 4 years of marriage, that quiet, complete way of seeing her that had begun on a November night in a barn when she had pushed her plate to a hungry child. She turned and saw him watching and said, "What? Nothing," he said. "I am just looking." "You look at me as if you are memorizing me," she said with mild exasperation. "I am," he said. She looked at him with those gray eyes, and the face underneath the face was briefly and clearly visible, and then she adjusted Margaret's position and said pragmatically, "We will be back in 4 days." "I know," he said. "Thomas will be fine. There is a stew in the pot and bread enough for 3 days and the—" "Ella," he said. "Yes, I know where the bread is," he said. "I live in the house." She made a small, slightly self-conscious sound that was almost a laugh. "I am aware," she said. "I am managing anxiety about leaving." "I know," he said gently. She looked at him. "I do not often leave," she said. "No," he said. "This is important work, though. They need to hear what you have built here." "What we have built," she said. He shook his head slightly. "You built the architecture," he said. "I helped with some of the rafters." "You built substantial rafters," she said. "Ella, James, go to Dallas," he said. "Tell them what you know. Come back in 4 days." She looked at him for a moment, and then she leaned forward and kissed him, there on the station platform with Margaret between them and Thomas pulling on the wagon wheel nearby, a real kiss, warm and certain, and then she straightened and said, "Mind the back porch door. The latch sticks in wet weather." "I know," he said. "I built the back porch door." She boarded the train and he stood on the platform until it moved and Thomas came to stand beside him and put his hand into his father's. "When are they coming back?" Thomas asked. 4 days, James said. "That is a lot of days," Thomas said. "It is," James agreed. Thomas thought about this. "Papa," he said, "why does Mama always know where everything is?" James looked down at his son. "Because she pays attention," he said. "She always has." Thomas considered this with the serious, earnest quality that was the most characteristic thing about him. "I want to pay attention like that," he said. "You are already learning," James said, and meant it. They drove home in the spring wagon through the afternoon light, father and son, past the edge of town, where the shelter stood solidly and practically, smoke from its chimney rising straight in the still air, and out along the road to their 40 acres, and the house in the live oaks that they had built for the life they intended to live. That evening, after Thomas was in bed, James sat on the back porch in the cooling April air and looked east across the land and thought. not for the first time but with a particular clarity that came only when he was alone, about November of 1882, about a horse throwing a shoe on a road that led nowhere else, about a barn full of hungry children and a woman who had sat with her hands in her lap and her plate pushed to the smallest child in the room. He thought about what he had seen that night and whether he would have had words for it at the time if someone had asked him. He thought the word was simply this: a person who is exactly who they are, not performing goodness, not calculating recognition, not working from obligation or from show, just being with full and unself-conscious honesty the person she was. He had seen it in the lamplight and he had never, not for one day in the years since, forgotten it. He had built his whole life alongside that, and it had been, by any measure he knew how to use, the best thing he had ever done. In 1888, when Thomas was 5 and Margaret was 2 and Ella was 33 and James was 37, a letter came from the Methodist Mission Board in Nashville. The letter was addressed to Ella and contained, after several paragraphs of organizational language, an offer. The board was establishing a new regional welfare coordination position, a role that would oversee community support programs across 4 counties in the Texas Panhandle region, based in Redemption Creek, but with a travel component, and a salary that represented a significant formal recognition of the work Ella had been doing for 6 years without formal title or compensation, beyond the satisfaction of doing it well. She read the letter at the kitchen table and then set it down and was quiet for a while. James poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from her. She told him about the letter. He read it. He set it down. "This is overdue recognition," he said. "It would require travel," she said. 4 counties is a significant territory. How much travel? The letter suggests perhaps 1 week per month, perhaps more in the establishment phase. He nodded. "That is manageable," he said. "Mrs. Duran has offered before to help with the children when we need it, and my current survey schedule is local." She looked at him. "You would not mind it," she said. "I would miss you when you are gone," he said. "That is different from minding it. Your work is important." It was important before anyone was calling it a position with a salary, and you did it anyway. The formal recognition does not change the value of what you do, but it allows you to do more of it with more support. She was quiet, looking at him with those gray eyes. "I have spent a long time," she said slowly, "being careful about what I need, not asking for things, making do. I find that when something is offered, my first instinct is still to wonder if I should take it." "Take it," he said. "James, Ella," he said, and he reached across the table the way he had across so many tables and took both her hands. "You gave away your dinner so a child could eat. You have been giving away the metaphorical dinner for a very long time. This is the world giving something back. Take it." She held his hands and looked at him, and the face underneath the face was fully present, clear and warm and real. "I would not have come to Redemption Creek if that minister had not written to Mrs. Potts," she said. "I would not have been in that shelter if the supply wagon had arrived with what was promised. You would not have been there if your horse had not thrown a shoe." She paused. "I think about the contingency of it sometimes, how narrow it was." "I think about it too," he said. "And then I think about how many other narrow contingencies in the world led to everything else. And I decide I would rather be grateful than alarmed by how close it came to not happening." "Yes," she said. "That is wiser. I learn from the people around me," he said. She squeezed his hands and then released them and picked up the letter again. "I will write to the board," she said, "with my acceptance and with the specific terms I require to make it workable." "Naturally," he said. "Do not smile like that," she said. "I am proud of you," he said. "You always say that," she said. "It is always true," he said. She looked at him across the table in the kitchen of their house, in the spring morning light of 1888, and she thought, not for the first time but with a clarity that sometimes surprised her in its fullness, about how it felt to be seen. Really seen. Not as a useful person or a capable person or an admirable person, which were all things she had been called and which had always felt somehow adjacent to the actual thing. But as herself, exactly as she was, hunger and patience and convictions and capacity, and the particular way she cared for things, not loudly but absolutely. He had been seeing her that way since the first night. She had known it even then, that the man across the table who had given away his dinner was watching her with the specific quality of attention that meant he was actually looking, not at what she was doing but at who she was. She had been careful with it for a long time because careful was what she knew and careful was generally wise. But she had said yes in a supply room and she had meant it completely, and every day since had confirmed that she had been right to mean it. "James," she said. "Yes." "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. He knew what she was thanking him for, not the coffee, not the conversation, not the specific moment. All of it. "Thank you," he said back, and meant it in the same comprehensive way. Outside, the spring air moved through the live oaks on their 40 acres, and the creek ran along the northern boundary and the back porch door held, the latch having been adjusted the previous winter to stop sticking in wet weather. A small repair, one of dozens made over years, the accumulated practical love of a life built carefully and continuously by two people who knew how to see what needed doing and did it. Margaret's voice rose from somewhere in the back of the house, already demonstrating her early talent for having opinions about things, and Thomas's patient, earnest response followed, and Ella pushed back her chair and went to manage whatever small crisis was unfolding, because she was the kind of person who went to things rather than waiting for them to come to her. James stayed at the table a moment longer, with his coffee and the spring light and the letter that would set the next chapter in motion, and he thought about a barn in November, and a plate pushed across a table, and a woman sitting with her hands in her lap and the quiet, absolute certainty in her face. He had seen her. He had never forgotten what he saw. He got up and went to find his family. The years settled into themselves the way good years do, not with dramatic resolutions but with the steady accumulation of lived days, each one adding its small weight to the structure of a life built well. Ella took the regional position and found her rhythm with it, 1 week traveling each month to the 3 other counties, conducting assessments and working with the local organizers she trained and supported, and 3 weeks at home, which remained centered on the house in the live oaks and the shelter in Redemption Creek, and the 2 children who grew at the particular alarming pace of healthy, loved children. Thomas, at 7, was reading at a level several years above his age, and had developed a solemnity about this fact that made both his parents work hard not to smile when he discussed it. Margaret, at 4, was approaching the world as a negotiation she intended to win, a quality that Ella watched with recognition and a careful attentiveness, because she understood from direct personal experience both the power and the cost of that disposition, and wanted her daughter to have the first without being worn down by the second. James's survey work had evolved, by the late 1880s, into a practice that was genuinely locally rooted, serving the growing community of settlers and small farmers across the county with assessment and planning work, supplemented by the income from their land, which they had expanded to 60 acres through a purchase in 1886, and which James managed with a methodical attention that reflected his surveyor's understanding of what land could and could not sustain. They were not wealthy by the standards of the time's wealthiest. They had everything they needed and a considered amount of what they wanted, and they had built it through work and attention, and the particular compound interest of treating people fairly over many years, which returned dividends in trust and community that were not quantifiable but were very real. Ella's regional position led, by 1890, to her being invited to contribute to a report on community welfare practice being compiled by a reform organization in Austin, a document that would eventually circulate to welfare administrators across the territory and influence the design of several county support programs. She wrote her section at the kitchen table over 3 weeks in the evenings with the same directness and precision she brought to everything. And when James read the draft she showed him, he was quiet for a long moment. "What?" she said. "I am reading the part where you describe the provision gap problem," he said, "and how the private supply arrangement solved it." "Yes. You have written it entirely in passive construction," he said, as if the solution materialized independently. She looked at the page. "It was a collaborative effort," she said. "Ella, you designed the Bower arrangement. You identified the gap, researched the solution, drafted the terms, and implemented it. That is not a collective passive construction. That is you doing those things. You carried the letter to Bower," she said. "As a courier," he said, "which is not the same thing as designing the solution." She looked at him. "Write it accurately," he said. "Not from false modesty." She rewrote the section. He was right, and she knew it, and she had known it while she was writing it the first way. And understanding why you efface yourself and choosing not to were two different skills, and she was, with his steady, consistent witness, getting better at the second. The 1890s brought changes to Redemption Creek and to the broader world. The frontier, as a concept and as a lived reality, was shifting and contracting. The Oklahoma Territory opened to homesteading. The cattle drives that had defined the preceding decades were giving way to rail transport. The world that James had surveyed from horseback was being mapped and fenced and settled, which produced grief in some quarters and opportunity in others. And the complex question of who bore the costs of the transformation and who received its benefits was one that Ella thought about and wrote about and worked on with the same practical honesty she brought to everything. Thomas, at 12, expressed a wish to study law, which neither of his parents found surprising. Margaret, at 9, expressed a wish to study medicine, which also surprised neither of them, and which James took particular care to treat as entirely unremarkable, because it was 1892 and the world had opinions about women studying medicine that were not always useful opinions. "It is difficult but not impossible," Ella told her, when Margaret had first said it, with the seriousness of a child who had been thinking about something for a while. "There are women physicians. It requires significant dedication, and you will meet resistance that your male counterparts will not." "Will you help me?" Margaret asked. "Every step," Ella said. Margaret nodded with the quality of a decision made and went back to whatever she had been doing, which was characteristic. James had been in the doorway during this exchange, and when Margaret had gone he had come to sit beside Ella at the kitchen table. "She will do it," he said. "Yes," Ella said. "She will. She is extremely stubborn." "She gets it from her mother," he said. "I prefer to call it determined," she said. "You would," he said, with the warm, familiar humor that had been part of them since a supply room conversation 6 years earlier. She leaned against his shoulder, which was something she did in private moments, still with the quality of someone for whom physical ease had been a gradual learning, a choosing to rest, and he put his arm around her, easy and sure, and they sat that way in the kitchen of their house as the afternoon light changed. In 1893, a third child arrived. A boy who came in early spring and was named William, called Will almost immediately, because he arrived with an energy that seemed too large for 3 syllables. He was a different kind of child than Thomas or Margaret, physical and loud and sunny in temperament, and the house on the 40-acre property absorbed this new energy with the solidity of something built to last. James held Will on the back porch the first week of his life, standing in the spring air while Ella slept, finally, after the sustained effort of arrival, and he looked at his youngest child and thought about what 11 years and 3 children and 1 marriage and 40 acres and a county's worth of relationships and a letter to a German wholesale supplier and a November barn and a plate pushed across a table had built. He thought about this. He thought about it with gratitude and without sentimentality, which was how he tried to think about important things. "Will," he said to his son, "this is Texas. This is your family's land. That is your father's general jurisdiction." He gestured, somewhat absurdly, at the horizon. We are working on leaving it better than we found it. You can help with that when you are ready." Will, approximately 4 days old and not in a position to respond constructively to philosophical statements, made a small fist against James's shirt. "Fair enough," James said. "We will revisit this conversation." Inside, Thomas was helping Margaret with her arithmetic, patiently, in the way he helped her with everything. And Ella slept in the bedroom with the east window open and the morning coming in. And the house held all of them in the particular, ordinary, extraordinary way of a home built with intention, and sustained with love and the daily work of two people who had learned to see each other clearly, and had chosen, with full information and honest hearts, to stay. Years later, when Thomas was a grown man and Margaret was a physician, and Will was still cheerfully loud, and the house in the live oaks had weathered 2 more decades of Texas weather, and the shelter in Redemption Creek had become a genuine institution with its own history and lineage, Thomas would be asked by his own children what he remembered most about his parents. He would think about it the way his mother had always thought about things completely before answering. "Your grandfather," he would say, "had a way of looking at your grandmother. From the time I was very small, I noticed it. Not a dramatic look. Just a steady one, as if he was always a little grateful to see her in the room, always a little aware of exactly where she was. He would pause. And your grandmother, when she was not looking, had a way of being aware of where he was too. You could see it in how she moved, how she organized herself in relation to him without seeming to think about it." And then he would say, because it was the truest thing he knew about them, "They saw each other. That is what I remember. Clearly and continuously, and without stopping." James Merritt had seen her first on a cold November night in 1882, by the light of a lamp in a barn, when she had pushed her plate to a child who was hungrier, and had sat with her hands folded in her lap with a patience that had nothing to do with submission and everything to do with choice. He had seen her, fully and honestly, from that moment forward. He had never forgotten what he saw. And she, who had learned to pay attention to everything because inattention was costly, had seen him in return, not dramatically and not all at once, but steadily and completely, until they were two people who knew each other to the ground, who had built something lasting together from nothing more and nothing less than the willingness to look clearly at what was real and to stay with what they found. Outside, the live oaks stood on the Texas land they had bought together in 1883, and the creek ran along the northern boundary, and the children, first 3, and then grown and gone, and returning with their own children, filled the house with the particular richness of a family that had been built by people who understood that love was not a feeling that happened to you, but a practice you chose every day. Made of attention and honesty and the willingness to give away your dinner when that was what the moment required, and to receive in return the extraordinary gift of being truly seen. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.